April 1943. A convoy of Liberty ships crept into New York Harbor under a grey morning sky. On their decks stood hundreds of captured German soldiers, the first wave of Axis prisoners bound for the United States. For weeks they had crossed the Atlantic in silence, guarded, disarmed and uncertain. Many expected to face humiliation or even execution. They had fought in Rommel's vaunted Africa Corps, believing they served the most advanced war machine in history. Yet what they were about to see would overturn everything they thought they knew. When the ships docked, the prisoners were met not by jeering mobs or harsh guards, but by order and efficiency. US military police escorted them calmly, issuing food, medical checks and uniforms. Their first glimpse of America was staggering. Massive cranes unloading cargo, trains clattering along rail lines, docks stretching as far as the eye could see. To men raised on Nazi propaganda, which described America as decadent and racially weak, this sight was nothing short of bewildering. Their journey to captivity began months earlier in North Africa. By early 1943, the German Africa Corps was collapsing under Allied pressure. At Kasserine Pass and later in Tunisia, thousands were surrounded. They had fought hard, disciplined, trained, loyal, but their supply lines were gone, their tanks destroyed, their commanders captured. As the Allies secured the region, a massive logistical operation began, transporting Axis prisoners across the Atlantic far from the front. The United States agreed to take in over 400,000 POWs, both to relieve pressure on Britain and to utilize their labor under Geneva Convention rules. To the Americans, it was a humane solution. To the Germans, it was an unimaginable journey into the heart of the enemy's homeland. The trip itself offered hints of what was coming. On board, they were given full rations. Canned meat, white bread, coffee, cigarettes. Even the guards shared meals. Some POWs refused at first, suspecting a trick, but as the days passed, suspicion turned to silent amazement. They began to notice how well-equipped everything was. The engines, the ship's kitchens, even the lights that burned through the night. Compared to their own convoys constantly short of fuel and food, this seemed like another world. When they finally saw the Statue of Liberty, one prisoner muttered in disbelief, "So this is the America our Führer mocked." For many, that single glimpse marked the beginning of an internal war between belief and reality. They were quickly loaded onto trains bound for camps scattered across the American heartland, Texas, Georgia, Nebraska, the Dakotas. The journey inland revealed something the Germans had never imagined, a land both vast and vibrant. Fields of wheat and corn stretching for miles, factories belching smoke day and night, railways crisscrossing endless towns. One officer described it later as the greatest army without uniforms, a country mobilized to the edge of impossibility. As the locomotives thundered west, the prisoners stared through barred windows, their minds racing. They were supposed to be superior, heirs to the world's finest engineers. Yet everywhere they looked, America moved faster, built bigger, produced more, and deep down, a quiet realization began to form. They were not the masters of the modern world. They were witnessing the nation that was. For most prisoners, the true surprise began once they reached the camps themselves. Texas alone hosted more than 30 major facilities, rows of barracks built on farmland, each surrounded by barbed wire, floodlights, and guard towers. Yet, behind those fences, life operated with astonishing normalcy. They were given clean bedding, access to libraries, sports fields, and even orchestras. Many POWs could scarcely believe they were in the same country that had bombed their Africa Corps into surrender just months earlier. The American guards followed strict Geneva Convention rules, and for the most part they treated prisoners with respect. But beneath that order, something else was forming. Quiet astonishment. The prisoners began to compare everything they saw to home. At Camp Swift, Texas, they noticed the rations first. Each meal came with meat, vegetables, bread, and even dessert. Items that their families back in Germany could no longer dream of. Butter, eggs, coffee, all in abundance. One prisoner later said, "We thought America must have conquered the world already." The contrast gnawed at their morale. Nazi propaganda had painted America as a collapsing democracy run by Jews and criminals. But these men were living proof that the Reich had been lying. And every day, the industrial pulse of America echoed beyond the camp fences. Distant train horns, the roar of engines, endless movement. Soon they were put to work, under supervision, in nearby farms, sawmills, and factories. The United States faced a labor shortage. Millions of American men were overseas, and farmers needed help harvesting crops. POWs filled the gap, earning a small wage credited to their accounts. Working beside ordinary Americans, the prisoners experienced their first moments of disorientation. Civilians often greeted them with curiosity, not hatred. Some women even brought lemonade to the fields. In the heat of a Texas summer, the lines between enemy and worker blurred. "Your prisoners are better fed than our soldiers," one local farmer joked. For the Germans, that joke hit uncomfortably close to the truth. Meanwhile, US officials monitored POW morale closely. Reports from the office of the Provost Marshal General noted that many prisoners were politically disillusioned. Some even began attending English classes or forming debate clubs about democracy. In Camp Butner, North Carolina, prisoners started newsletters that quietly questioned Nazi ideals. In others, like Fort Robinson, Nebraska, camp orchestras performed Beethoven and Bach for local American audiences. These were not indoctrination camps, yet education and exposure worked quietly, powerfully. The more the Germans saw, the more they doubted everything they'd been taught. But change didn't come easily. Among the POWs were loyal Nazis who policed their peers, warning against American corruption. Secretive groups formed within the camps, spreading fear and propaganda. Fights broke out between moderates and hardliners. And for many, the internal war between loyalty and disbelief had only just begun. As one prisoner later confessed, "We were trapped between two worlds, the one we were told existed, and the one right before our eyes." And soon, that inner conflict would erupt, when German officers were forced to confront the true engine of America's power, its factories. By 1944, the United States had fully transformed into a war production colossus. Everywhere the prisoners looked, the evidence was overwhelming. Fleets of trucks, new aircraft roaring overhead, factories that never slept. At Camp Huntsville in Alabama, several POWs were permitted, under guard, to work at nearby industrial sites. For men raised on images of a weak America, the reality of US in Germany, "We built weapons with precision." Here, they built them with speed. From Detroit to Dallas, the arsenal of democracy had achieved something no Axis nation could match: scale without chaos. Factories produced tanks, planes, and ships as if they were household appliances. At the Willow Run plant in Michigan, a B-24 Liberator rolled off the line every 63 minutes. At Ford's River Rouge complex, molten steel flowed through channels like rivers of fire, pouring into endless molds. Some POWs were allowed to view these plants as part of controlled labor rotations or morale studies. They returned to camp speechless. How could a nation so relaxed, so seemingly disorganized, operate like this? It was not just industry that impressed them, it was the culture behind it. The idea that ordinary citizens could question their leaders, strike for better pay, or move freely between jobs was beyond the German imagination. In one camp, an interpreter recalled POWs marveling at newspaper headlines critical of President Roosevelt. They couldn't understand how a leader could be criticized openly, and yet nothing collapsed. For many, that was the first moment they realized what freedom meant in practice. The abundance, the open discussion, the confident casualness, all of it shattered the myth of American weakness. But for others, the realization was painful. Those who had devoted themselves to the Nazi ideal began to see its fragility. America's power was not born from fear but from cooperation. Its soldiers were volunteers, its workers motivated by opportunity rather than terror. One captured officer described it in a letter home, censored but later archived. "Their strength comes not from obedience but from trust. It is an engine we could never build." Some prisoners quietly turned away from their hardline comrades. Others clung to ideology even harder, unable to reconcile pride with truth. At night, when floodlights flickered over the camp fences, the POWs could still hear the distant thunder of trains. Boxcars loaded with weapons and food headed to ports, all bound for war. Those sounds carried more than freight, they carried a message. The Reich had peaked, and the new world, powered by steel and freedom, was already rolling toward victory. But even as Germany's empire crumbled abroad, another quiet transformation was taking place inside the camps themselves, one that would echo long after the war ended. By mid-1944, the German prisoners scattered across America had begun to realize something profound. The country that captured them was not merely winning the war, it was redefining it. Behind the fences of their camps, they could hear a nation in constant motion, the low rumble of trains carrying coal and ammunition, the echo of factory whistles in nearby towns, the glint of truck convoys passing on endless highways. It was as if the entire continent had become a single, coordinated machine. And for the men who once believed that Germany's industry was unmatched, the sound of American progress was both awe-inspiring and humiliating. At Camp Huntsville in Alabama, a handful of POWs were selected for labor duties near a local assembly plant. They expected small workshops or basic tools. Instead, they were escorted into a facility unlike anything they had seen before. Rows of conveyor belts carried engines down long corridors. Sparks flew from welding torches. Hundreds of men and women worked shoulder to shoulder, precision without panic, order without shouting. One POW engineer later wrote, In Germany, a factory is an empire. Here it is an organism. Every man knows his part. That day marked a quiet turning point for many of them. The myth of the disorganized American died right there, among the clang of wrenches and the smell of hot steel. From coast to coast, America's wartime production outpaced anything the world had ever witnessed. In Michigan alone, the Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant produced one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. In California, shipyards at Richmond launched a new Liberty ship almost daily. To a German mind, this kind of industrial acceleration was impossible. Back home, even the most advanced factories had long since been crippled by Allied bombing and resource shortages. One prisoner remembered his first view of an American assembly line. In the Reich, we built machines. In America, they built a world that built machines. For them, it was a confrontation, not only with defeat, but with an entirely different idea of civilization. One built on abundance, not scarcity. The revelation extended beyond the machinery. German soldiers who worked in small-town workshops or farm equipment depots saw something even more unsettling. The workers were not afraid. Women handled heavy equipment with confidence. Foremen joked with their teams. Teenagers in overalls repaired engines and listened to swing music blaring from radios. This was a society that allowed individuality, even while waging total war. There was no Gestapo lurking behind every conversation, no propaganda officer dictating their thoughts. Some POWs whispered to each other late at night that perhaps freedom itself, the thing they'd been taught to mock, might be America's most powerful weapon. Meanwhile, the US Army Psychological Warfare Division began documenting POW reactions. Reports from 1944 describe increasing admiration among German prisoners for American organization, democracy, and industrial speed. The irony was not lost on US officers. These men, once the embodiment of Nazi discipline, were now marveling at the freedom of their captors. A Count Butner interpreter noted in his logbook, "They cannot understand how chaos produces order, how laughter makes strength. For some, it was a moment of awakening. For others, it was unbearable, a slow erosion of everything they believed." At night, they would hear the distant rumble of locomotives, the arteries of the American war machine, pumping endlessly toward the coasts. Each train was loaded with tanks, food and munitions, the lifeblood of a war effort that seemed infinite. A German captain later said, "When I heard those trains, I knew we had already lost." The prisoners realized that the Reich's dream of domination had collided with something far greater, a democracy that could build faster, think freer, and fight longer. It wasn't just the defeat of an army, it was the defeat of an idea. But even as the thunder of American industry grew louder, another transformation was quietly taking place, one not of steel or smoke, but of conscience. By the final winter of the war, the transformation within the POW camps had become unmistakable. The fences remained, the guards still watched from towers, but the fear, that instinctive tension of captivity, had begun to fade. In towns across Texas, Georgia, and Nebraska, German prisoners worked side by side with American civilians, building barns, repairing roads, and harvesting crops. The men who once marched under the swastika were now plowing American soil. They were no longer soldiers. They were witnesses to a country whose power was built not on conquest, but on cooperation. For many, the labor was liberating. They saw families laughing at dinner tables, young men returning on leave, communities pooling resources to send care packages overseas. America wasn't perfect. There was rationing, there were protests, and there were divides, yet it functioned. And that fact alone baffled the prisoners. One man recalled, "We were told that democracy was chaos, but here, chaos had order, and order had mercy." Farmers often spoke with the POWs through fences or while supervising in the fields. Some even trusted them enough to enter homes for meals. Such small moments, repeated across the nation, softened the hardened edges of the war. When the news of Germany's collapse arrived in 1945, the camps erupted with emotion. For many prisoners, it was the confirmation of what they had already sensed. The Reich had lost not just a war, but its moral compass. Some cried silently, others stared blankly at the ground, unwilling to face the truth. A few fanatics, still loyal to Hitler's vision, threatened those who spoke of defeat. At Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, a violent clash broke out. A Nazi loyalist strangled a fellow prisoner accused of sympathy toward America. The US Guards restored order swiftly, but the incident revealed how deep the ideological fractures ran. Even behind barbed wire, Germany was still at war with itself. When surrender became undeniable, the tone inside the camps shifted. The songs of defiance gave way to hymns. Prisoners requested news from Europe of their families, their cities, their shattered homeland. What they read stunned them. Hamburg burned, Dresden destroyed, the Ruhr reduced to rubble. In contrast, the land around them thrived, fields green, factories humming, the hum of engines echoing across an untouched continent. That contrast burned itself into their memory. They realized that they had seen the future, and it wasn't in ruins, it was across the ocean. Repatriation began slowly. In 1945, the first groups of POWs were sent home, many through New York or Boston ports. For some, the journey back to a devastated Germany felt like exile. They had come to associate America with stability, with hope. A POW named Hans Müller wrote in his memoirs, "We came to America as prisoners. We left as students of freedom." Back in Germany, these men carried their impressions into the heart of Reconstruction. They told their families of American schools, newspapers, and churches of communities that debated openly, yet still stood united. These stories became seeds planted in a broken nation. American guards and townspeople too were changed. They learned that the enemy was not always cruel or alien, but human, hungry, tired, and just as disillusioned by war. When the last POW camp closed in 1946, the fences came down quietly. In their place, friendships remained. Postcards, photographs, even reunions decades later, out of captivity had grown connection, and from that connection, understanding. And when peace settled over a divided world, that understanding, born in barbed wire camps, would help shape a fragile but lasting alliance between former enemies. When the last German POWs sailed home in 1946, their departure barely made headlines. America was already turning its eyes toward victory celebrations, demobilization, and the dawn of a new era. But for the men who had lived behind those fences, the experience would linger for the rest of their lives. They returned to a homeland in ruins, a land of bombed-out factories, broken railways, and shattered faith. And when they spoke of America, they spoke not of punishment, but of revelation. They had seen the true arsenal of democracy, not just its machines, but its mindset. Historians later called these men the accidental ambassadors. They carried home stories that contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had ever told them. Stories of factories run by free citizens, of guards who followed the rules, of civilians who treated enemies with decency. Their tales spread quietly, shaping conversations in post-war Germany about freedom, responsibility, and rebuilding. Some former POWs became teachers, engineers, or civic leaders. They built businesses that mirrored the efficiency they'd seen in America, but grounded in fairness rather than fear. Others found themselves haunted, forever comparing the ruins of the Reich to the abundance they had once witnessed across the Atlantic. For the United States, these camps became a quiet chapter of victory, one measured not in battles won, but in minds changed. The government's adherence to the Geneva Convention and the everyday humanity shown by farmers and townsfolk accomplished what propaganda never could. By treating prisoners humanely, America had projected its greatest strength, moral confidence. Even in the midst of total war, it had refused to become what it fought against. Years later, American veterans would remember the same thing: the surprised smiles of German POWs, the polite salutes exchanged, the gratitude in eyes once filled with defiance. In the Cold War that followed, those small acts of decency paid quiet dividends. Many of those former POWs became voices of moderation in a divided Germany, rejecting extremism on both sides. They knew firsthand the cost of lies and the value of truth. Some even returned to the United States decades later, visiting the very farms or towns where they once labored in captivity. They found that the people who had guarded them remembered too. Handshakes replaced salutes, shared meals replaced fences. Those reunions stood as living proof that compassion could outlast conflict. They came expecting to see a decaying democracy. Instead, they witnessed a civilization fueled by freedom, where strength came not from obedience but from opportunity. In the hum of engines, in the laughter of factory workers, and in the open fields of America's heartland, they saw the future, and when they returned home, they carried that vision with them, a vision of a world where freedom, not fear, builds the mightiest machines of all.